Hello everybody and welcome to this CEM webinar. I'm Gemma Valpy and I'm the Head of Business Development for CEM here in the UK. Today's webinar is using CEM data in your school's evaluation and development plan, and we're delighted to be joined by Jonathan Allday. Jonathan has worked as a teacher, subject head, faculty head and academic deputy at several boarding and day schools across the UK. In that time, Jonathan has become a passionate believer in the use of data to improve pupil and staff aspirations and the academic standards of an institution. His other main interest has been the use of technology in the classroom and how that, in combination with data, can raise achievement and understanding. He's the official HMC liaison with CEM, representing the views of the academic deputies on CEM data and developments. And in June last year, in 2020, he officially retired and is now working as a consultant, offering his experience of CEM data, curriculum development, timetabling and management to schools. So Jonathan is going to cover today his experience of using CEM data to inform a school-wide evaluation and development plan and how that supports a culture of learning and improvement.
As mentioned in the introduction, I've been involved with the use of CEM data for more years than I care to admit, really. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that I've got it all completely nailed in place, but I have worked with and for a number of institutions with a variety of different structures and ethoses and ways of doing things. And so over that time, I guess I may have a little bit of experience that might be of use in terms of suggesting ways in which you can approach how your development and evaluation can be enhanced by the use of data. Some of what I'm about to say you may well know already. Some of it I hope I'll give a different spin on, and I'm just hoping there might be at least one or two new things here for you to either violently disagree with or think that might be worthwhile pursuing in your own institutions. And of course, we all have the dream, don't we? We have the dream that somewhere there exists precise, unambiguous and definitive data that allows us to make sensible judgments on the nature of our intake, what consistency there might be in the pupils that we admit to our schools, what their attitudes might be, and how we can best monopolise those in the classroom, or indeed how we might best support the pupils who need that little bit of extra support, perhaps because their skill sets in certain areas are not quite what we might hope for, or might not quite what will enable them to access what their potential suggests that they can achieve in certain subjects. The data might also allow us to evaluate the effectiveness of policies that we have, particularly in the teaching and learning arena. And in general terms, have some idea of what the performance of our school is. How well are we doing, both in absolute terms, although also in terms of, in some instances, our competitors, particularly if we're in the independent sector, perhaps. And this data, in an ideal world, will inform our planning and our policy going forward. But of course, the reality is that data is messy. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, in the use of data is, in a sense, knowing when not to use data. Or perhaps to phrase it slightly better, knowing the limitations of the data and knowing how it should be used alongside other things. So data has to be handled carefully. It needs more than one instance, by which I mean you can't draw any conclusions from one data point. If you have two data points, then you're at liberty to draw a line, but you can't really be sure that this is a true line until you've got at least 3 data points. There's a bit of a scientist in me leaking out here, for which I apologise. But I'm sure all of us appreciate that it's very, very rash to draw conclusions just based on one instance. And also, I think there is a temptation, and if I may say so, being a retired member of the clan myself, particularly amongst senior leaders, to take too fine-grained an approach to the data, to mine the data, if I can phrase it that way, for information or conclusions that really aren't warranted. And I'll say a little bit more about that in one particular instance to illustrate what I mean a little bit later on. So I think what I'm saying is that data is one instrument that needs to be used alongside others. I'll come back to it a bit later on, but I think one of the things that I've grown to understand about data is when you see data relevant to your school, very little really ought to take you by surprise. In a sense, as senior leaders, we ought to know our school that well that the data should confirm our impressions that we have already. There is always something that might well take us by surprise in the detail, illuminating something for our future consideration. But the broad sweep of what the data tells us should really confirm what we already know by other means. And to sort of reiterate the point, data will come with natural variations. It's a little bit like the spin bowler who takes a wicket by the ball that doesn't turn and then claims he intended to bowl it that way. That's a cricketing analogy, which I hope will mean something to many of you. There are natural variations, and we should be wary of jumping to a conclusion based on what we think is a trend, but actually it's just a natural variation. Now, of course, we all have our development plans, the instruments by which we turn our vision into management, into deployment, or whatever the phrase is inside our institutions. And a development plan needs to be informed by a clear picture of where you are. You can't get to where you want to go unless you know where you're starting from. And the development plan sets out to address what are the perceived weaknesses, to build on the strengths that we're aware of in the school, to express the vision that's so important but ever so difficult to pin down, the vision of what you want to be. Perhaps it also is designed to preempt some challenges that may be coming to you down the line. How well can we read the tea leaves of what's happening in our local areas, in the context in which we're trying to operate? What socioeconomic challenges are coming in our direction? What might be happening to the catchment, the area from which we are drawing our pupils? What might be happening to us in terms of staffing? Do we have one of those demographic time bombs ticking away, whereby all of our teachers are getting older and older, but we're not recruiting that many younger ones in at the other end, so there's going to be a bit of an issue coming towards us in the future, perhaps. All of these things are folded into the ambition, at least, if not the explicit formulation of the development plan. So where does chem data fit into that? Well, I would suggest that broadly, you may disagree with this, but this is the way I think about it, there are two broad aspects to policy within schools. One, and perhaps the most important, is policy relating to teaching and learning. How can we make sure, how can we provide the space in which our teachers and our learners can achieve the best that they possibly can? I generally feel that our role here is to get out of the way as much as we can and let them do their thing, and to create a space in which they feel enabled to do their thing. But the other aspect is perhaps school evaluation, looking at the broad context of our school, looking at the vision and where we want to be, etc. Now, initially, at least, prima facie, you might think, chem's role is in the latter, because after all, without being too sure of the detailed history of how chem came to be, I am pretty sure it started out as a group of related research projects looking into what we now know as value added. This idea of how can you evaluate what is going on in your schools by doing some comparison with other schools based on standardized testing that you give your pupils at some point. That, in a sense, is the raison d'etre, if I can put it that way, given the presence of chem people in the virtual room with us. I think that is the raison d'etre on which chem set itself up. But I believe, in fact, their most valuable resource to us is actually the baseline test. And I would suggest, if I may, in institutions that I've had contact with, where chem data is perhaps not used to its best, is where there is an overemphasis, often historical, on the value-added side, and an underemphasis on the role of the actual baseline data itself, which I believe directly impacts on teaching and learning. Now, I put that in a context for you, because I think if you sort out, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting what I'm about to say is in any sense trivial or easy, but if you sort out your teaching and learning, your support and interventions where necessary for pupils who may be struggling in certain areas, or indeed need stretching in areas, your use of baseline data, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second, if you have some mechanism by which you set challenge grades, academically aspirational grades for your pupils in the run-up to marker examinations, public examinations, and if you have support and some level of monitoring of progress going on, and I would say that a challenge grade has to be a teacher's best professional judgment. In the end, that is what it would be, their best professional judgment of the aspirational possibilities for a particular pupil, but based on performance in class, performance in tests, homeworks, etc., experience of similar students, and baseline data, in particular projected grades. I've talked about this in another webinar. I believe we shouldn't be emphasizing the predicted or projected grades. We should be working with chances graphs. If you're interested a little bit more in that, then the previous webinars are viewable on the CEM website. But all of this rolled together are instruments that teachers use to set these challenge grades, to stretch and to inspire pupils, to raise their aspirations. And if you have some measure of departmental self-review and school review in operation, said it wasn't going to be easy to do all this, but the point is, if you've got all this sort of thing sorted out, then the value added will take care of itself. You will see value added in your school if you work in this sort of way. And I believe that sometimes what gets in the way of using baseline data to inform us about our pupils, to set relevant challenge grades, to raise aspirations, is a sort of fear that exists in our institutions because of the implied judgment on performance that the value added puts in place. I'll develop this thinking as we go along.
Jonathan, can I just jump in with a question?
Oh, yes.
So we have a question here, and it might be something you're going on to cover, but I'll ask it now on behalf of one of the delegates. Where would you get started if a senior leadership team and teachers are not familiar with analysing data? Are there specific reports you would focus on?
I am going to say a little bit more about that as we go along, yes. So, but please keep note of that and come back to me if I don't satisfactorily answer it. But I am going to mention some very specific reports in about 4 or 5 slides time, I think. So if you just bear with me for a minute, but pull me up if you don't think I'm doing a job of answering the question. So just to come back for a second, if I may, what I'm suggesting is that in some institutions, historically, there has grown up some degree of data doubting. And I believe this comes as a result of an overemphasis on value added at the expense of baseline. Value added does have its role, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. It is a useful measure of the school, of where the school is. It can be useful for heads of department to see how their departments are performing in a national scale, but also with respect to other departments within the school where they're working. But by and large, any idea of matters relating to value added, I think should be kept away from individual teachers. In other words, this idea that it's an implied judgment on their performance should be suppressed. So to move on and start to talk a little bit about how we might actually set about using baseline data, its most immediate and obvious role is in giving us some assessment of our intake. So if we do some level of baseline testing, whether that be Midgis or Yellis, nothing against Yellis, but personally, I didn't use it. I tended to use Midgis in year 7 and year 9. I know many schools swear by the use of Yellis as well. But if I talk about Midgis, just use that as a general term for all the chem instruments. And we know that it basically tests vocabulary and mathematics, non-verbal skills, and also the broad term of skills, which is broken down into proofreading and perceptual skills and accuracy. Talk a little bit more about those in a second. And by and large, the test is timed with compulsory questions. And here's the key bit, spread across the ability range. Because if you're using the computer adaptive test, I'm not sure how many of you know exactly how this works or the philosophy behind it. But the basic idea is, in the computer adaptive sections, the computer will ask pupils steadily harder questions as they get them right, until such time as they start to get them wrong, in which case they'll dial back a bit until they hone in on where the pupil's actual level is. And generally by in the mid-20s of questions, it has honed in on a particular level with great accuracy on the day to which that pupil is. And the adaptive part is done in the maths and vocabulary section, and the overall Midgis score is a blended mix of those two. Now, when it comes to administering the test, there are questions as to when you actually take it. I would always look to do it very early in the school's development cycle so that I can get the data into the hands of teachers as soon as possible. If it's going to have any use to them, it has to be early to help them understand the pupils they have in their classroom. I think it's very important to consider how you brief the pupils in terms of what this test is. The very use of the word test can generate a degree of angst. So you need to allay their fears. I had a particular script that I always used when I was talking to them, where I spoke on the idea that this was a way of assessing their relative strengths and weaknesses, so we could stretch them and support them in the areas where they were good, but actually provide a little bit of extra help and extra development in areas where they might not be quite so well developed. So I was explaining the purpose behind. But notice also, I tended not to talk about the role of the data as prediction of what you might do at GCSE. It was more about, this is a way of the teachers getting to know you, to help you and support you. And of course, what we get back from this is the individual pupil records, the IPRs. Here's an anonymized example for the particular pupils, each one differently. The overall score, as I've always also mentioned, is a combination of the vocab and the maths. And each of these scores has what's called the 95% confidence band, which means that basically we can be sure that if the student took the test over and over and over again, 95% of the time, their score would lie somewhere within that range there. It's actually the range, I think, that's more important. Sometimes we get held up on the specific exact value, but as I said, if they retake the test, even the next day, they might get a slightly different value, but it's going to lie within that range. Now, you can see on this particular instance, all of those are compatible scores. They overlap. A statistician would say there is no evidence of any difference in skill across that range of scores. But between those two, there is some evidence that there is a difference in skill level there. It may well be something we need to keep an eye on with that particular pupil going forward. So I always used to get all the IPRs and sit down with my curriculum support unit and flick through them looking for little oddities like that. And then we would say, yeah, here's a pupil we possibly need to keep an eye on. It's not diagnostic by any means, but if we put it alongside other evidence that we might be seeing in the classroom, then maybe at some point we need to be thinking about a more valid diagnostic test for this pupil. But even if there's nothing particularly outstanding in that regard, then what we are seeing here is a chart of relative strengths and weaknesses that we can exploit in the class, where we might need to do a little bit of support or indeed to stretch. And the key point here is that this data is triggering a conversation about the pupil. And I always used to try and engender a way of thinking where the data itself was less important than the conversation that it triggered. What do we know about this pupil? What extra information do we now have about this pupil? Because we've got to sort of watch out, again, for taking too detailed an approach to this. Data starts discussions. It can trigger debate about teaching and learning. It can put a new perspective on pupils, and it certainly helps us to target our teaching and our tutoring. And it is those knock-on things, those arising from the data, where the real value lies. Now, if we just take a quick look at the different parts of the test, the vocab score, clearly the most culturally linked. It measures fluency rather than knowledge, and it impacts on most, if not all, subjects. And it can, if a pupil is comparatively weaker in this vocab area, it can lead to quite stressful situations for the pupil, not understanding what's happening in the classroom, not understanding what questions are asking them in tests and preps and that sort of thing. So there might be a need for some further investigation and support in this area. But notice the interesting idea here, which is not my own, but someone pointed out to me, that if you're looking at a low vocab score for a particular individual, you need to be aware that this can lead to them being under stress. The maths score actually correlates very well with success in a wide range of subjects because of the analytical thinking aspects, but it particularly impacts on subjects needing numerical skills, logical thinking, and sequencing. So much is obvious, but it correlates well with a broad variety of subjects. The non-verbal score, this is a little bit more intriguing because you sometimes don't realize or think about what the consequences of this are, but actually if a pupil isn't so fluent in looking at something in 2D and realizing what that means in 3D, then they might struggle obviously in things like DT. But what about map reading? Whole areas of geography, perhaps, geophysics type things, they might be harder for them. But indeed, if their spatial awareness isn't perhaps as acute as others, then maybe it'll have impact in things like games and PE, where you might not expect it to. Because after all, it's all about extracting info from visual images. The skills score breaks down into the proofreading, perceptual speed and accuracy, which is all about matching symbols under time pressure, scanning and skimming skills, and it impacts on speed, processes of working, performance in tests and exams, and in general written work, how well they have the ability to check their own work, which they tend to do very quickly anyway, so are they accurate in doing it quickly? All of these things are impacting directly in the classroom and provide us with useful information about our pupils. That's at the sort of individual level. But what about the cohort level, our intake as a whole? Now, as many of you know, the mid-year score is broadly divided into 4 bands, A, B, C, D, like that, with 25% of the national population in each band. A and D are wider in terms of the levels of percentage they cover, the percentiles they cover, simply because we're at the outer edges of the bell curve compared to C and B, but they're all 25% of the population. Now, it's intriguing and interesting to look at your intake compared to that national distribution, because that may well have a direct impact on your policy in terms of for example, it might have an impact on how much curriculum time you devote to certain subject areas. It might have an impact on cross-subject emphasis in terms of if we're broadly have fewer than 25% with good vocab scores, maybe we need a whole school literacy policy to impact on this. So just showing you, this is examples from a school I've worked with in the past, which is obviously an academically very able school. There's the vocab scores with the proportions in each band. 61% were in band A, 24% were in band B. But if I just flick through the same year, there's maths. And so you start to see something very interesting here. A large proportion of the pupils were in a top band for maths. That might be something the maths department needs to know. Non-verbal, similar sort of distribution, but look at the skills score. Now again, this is a variable set of intake, but the skills scores are much more broadly spread than other scores. This may well have impact directly in the classroom when we're looking at how our pupils perform across the board. And you're looking at issues year on year. We're looking at the possibility of literacy interventions, numeracy interventions. And remember what I said about stress, pupils where they are perhaps struggling in certain areas and didn't expect to. And it's all down to perhaps slightly weaker vocab skills that can cause behavioural issues. This is also useful for what I refer to as calibrating your internal exams. You know, if you look at your midges scores and rank order them, do they tend to agree with the rank orderings in terms of your end of year, end of term, end of topic type examinations? Are you looking for individuals that stick out? Pupils who did very, very well perhaps on the midges scores, but aren't performing that well in examinations? What's going on there? The other way round is possibly less of a cause for concern, because pupils can always have a bad day on an individual exam or indeed on the midges score. But if they are repeatedly underperforming compared to midges, then looking at individuals is something you perhaps want to look at here. I also think it's extremely useful. That's an extra sort of step that you have to take when you look at your data spreadsheet to break the skills into its two separate components, as I've done here. Although there's not much to see in this particular distribution of that much note, except the PSA, the performance is a bit better than the proofreading. We're talking here again about how well can they detect mistakes under pressure. And I found this very useful to share this data, in particular with the language and the English departments. They like to know about this at an individual level, but also at the broad spectrum of what was going on that year in the intake. There is also the possibility of looking at trends in your intake over years. So here we've got old data from 2003 to 2008, and it's actually the overall score. And you can see for this particular school how the overall score of their intake varied year on year. The answer to which is really not very much. Nothing much to see here. But this, again, can slightly disguise some detail. This is where I said that sometimes the data, it is useful to mine the data for some details, because another interesting plot that you can also do is look at the band distribution over time. Now, the different colours in these blocks here, the reddish colour at the top is band D, the orange band C, the yellow band B, and the green is band A. Now, it's plausible, indeed it is the fact, because it's broadly the same data, excuse me, that the average score could be the same in each case. But look at what's going on here. We can see a very interesting pattern which is going to impact on policy, particularly towards the latter years, where you can see there's a marked shrinkage in band B broadly, compared to a rise, an almost inexorable rise by the look of the data, in band D. Interestingly, the band A is staying roughly similar. Most of the squeeze seems to be in band B. Now, you wouldn't necessarily see that intake data if you focused on those box plots. These band plots are of use. So these sorts of trends that we can pick up in our data are of use when we're talking about stretching the most able. But I also suggest they are particularly use for looking for the forgotten middle, those pupils in the broad area of ability range, those B-type pupils who might be getting Cs. They could be your results drivers. There may well be a need for intervention for others in terms of broad literacy and numeracy policy rather than individual interventions where individual pupils are struggling? Have we got a situation that needs to be addressed here by cross-curricular policies? And do we need to be looking at well-being as an issue for some of our intake? I might even venture to suggest, if we're seeing some patterns in our data of our intake, is it worth sometimes talking to our feeder schools, difficult though that may be to do politically, and some level of working together perhaps to understand and address issues. Moving on slightly, chances graphs, this is perhaps a slightly contentious area. Firstly, they're not chance. We need to keep on emphasizing the terrible name chances graphs. What we're looking at here is the likelihood or the proportion of pupils that might get different grades based on the ability distribution that you've got and previous results from similar ability distributions. So we're looking at a projection based on previous population performance. And this is a whole school chart here, which I've plucked out to show you just as an idea. And we're looking at what fraction of the school might achieve 5 or more 9 to 4 grades at GCSE. So this is looking at, from baseline data down the line, what GCSE results might be coming out of those pupils. But it gives you a long time to deal with any issues that you might detect in that data. So we're looking at here at more nuanced data than just the raw predictions or projections of GCSE grades. We're not looking so much at what individuals might get. We're looking at the broad sweep of how the school might perform further down the line. But again, don't regard this as being an absolute prediction with Nostradamus-like accuracy. This is just, you're heading in this sort of direction. Is that a direction you want to be going in? Or do you need to sort of steer the ship a little bit in the meantime? So I've emphasized it a few times, but just to come back to this notion of literacy and numeracy policies that might need enhancing or tweaking with regard to trends in your intake data. Of course, we must remember that if we're talking about these sorts of policies, they're not just the responsibility of our English and mathematics departments. If they have to have any impact whatsoever, they've got to be worked with across the broad curriculum. It needs a whole school approach, coordinated between departments. And we mustn't forget that a good use of literacy and numeracy and related policies is also to stretch and challenge the most able, not just simply to support the weaker end. We need to be working with our EAL and SEND colleagues if anything is thrown up in the data that's relevant. But I particularly object to, no teachers say this explicitly, but there is some notion, I sometimes think, that their pupils are extracted from the classroom where they're sent to support to be fixed, and then we teach them just the same as everybody else. No. It is necessary to adapt teaching and learning to the needs of pupils that may have educational needs for us. But what's good for them is also good for the broad sweep of pupils in the classroom as well. So anything that focuses in on different approaches to teaching and learning has to be a good thing. And again, the data shows the extent of any issues we may have, and indeed the effectiveness of any policy. I used to think it would be an interesting thing, not something I developed in detail, but something I would look to do later on if I had the chance. Look at year 7 versus year 9, or indeed year 10, 11 with Yellis, and see how our cohort developed over the intervening years and what policies we'd put in place to support development. How effective had they been? Well, let's get on just to talk about value added, and let's just rehearse what value added is. This notion that you have a baseline score which divides the pupils into low, average and high ability. You wait for their outcome grades. You get a chart that looks a little bit like this, with the broad sweep of data in the middle inside that outlined area there, and the dark magicians at Chem do their stuff and produce a regression line for us, which is a sort of best fit line to the data. which means that any particular individual who has a particular midges score on the day, we can project that they're likely to get that sort of GCSE grade, or indeed A-level grade if it's Alice, in a few years' time. But if they outperform that, they get a higher grade, then that is what's referred to as a positive residual. If they unfortunately underperform that, then that gives them what's known as a negative residual. Now, as I've said before, I believe that this is possibly the most threatening aspect of data in the classroom, because it leads to this notion that perhaps performance measurement is going on. But I would suggest, as I said before, that if you get this sort of thing right, then actually the value added will take care of itself. A teacher in the classroom doesn't need to be directly related to the value added. Given the space to do their thing, support them in doing it, and the value added will come about. Our role as management is to evaluate the evidence and to support the teaching staff and to give them the space and the confidence to do their work and take risks that may well lead to greater aspirations and indeed performance. But inevitably, we do look at things like the average standardized residual chart, this sort of thing that you may see, which tells us where our school lies across the broad sweep of schools using the CEM data. But it's very important not to overinterpret this. It's a common misunderstanding to suggest that the most academic schools lie on the left. Just because you're a highly academic and selective school, perhaps doesn't mean that you necessarily achieve good value added. You can look at these at a subject level as well, but again, let's not be too hung up on individual data instances. We need to be looking at trends over time, because small changes can make a big difference. So for example, you've got that vertical, what's called error bar there, that vertical line. If we improved our data, I hope you can just see that green square that's popped up. If we improve our data to the top of that line, then we'd shift up in the rankings. But if our data dropped to the bottom of that line, then we would shift down in the rankings. And that's quite a big shift for a small change in average standardized residual. This is a very flat chart across the broad span. But again, this could be glossing over some important details, which I'll come back to. At the department level, we do have these average residual charts. You can see here the different subjects. Drama is achieving 2.2, on average 2.2 grades better than the projections. These are the raw residuals, which are directly linked to grades. But the scatter of the data, you can see music and maths there, the maths data is much more tightly correlated than the music data is. So comparison between subjects is actually quite hard. It's not a fair comparison because the scatter of data about the regression line is different. Outliers can pull your conclusions in different directions. This is why, again, the dark magicians at CEM produce what are called standardized residuals as well, where the data has been massaged so that the spread around the regression line is the same for each subject, making comparison possible. This breaks the link to grades, so plus or minus 1 in standard residual is actually between 0.8 and 1 grade, depending on the subject. But it does mean you can make fair comparisons. So looking at design technology and looking at German here and looking at combined science, we are seeing valid comparisons between subjects where the data has been massaged to take away things like the spread of achievement around the regression line and the impact of having larger or smaller cohorts. These confidence limits are important. You've got the 95 and 98% confidence limits. The ones in white are within the confidence limits, which means that we can't be certain that these results aren't effectively zero. But the ones in green are showing some statistical significance as being above the norm, and the one in red is showing some statistical significance of below the norm. And I did used to make, considering of these charts, part of the annual review cycle I went through with the department. I tended to meet with my heads of department individually at least twice a year, one in each term, once for review of their own development plans, budget allocations, requests, that sort of thing, and once to look at results and staffing and timetabling. But if you're going to draw conclusions, then you need multiple trends for a year. And this is why this other chart, which is showing the average standardized residual for a particular department, in this case English, over time. And again, a single year is not significant, and you have to pay mind to these confidence bands. And I would venture to suggest you have to hold your nerve. So the ones I've outlined in green here are of some statistical significance, but the ones in orange aren't, because they're just clipping the outer confidence interval, which means that that data point there really shouldn't cause you to panic, because it's one sitting between two others, which are just skirting the edge of the confidence in it. But maybe that run of 3 at the end there is starting to see a trend that you perhaps might want to dig into a little bit more deeply.
Jonathan.
Hello.
Hello, I've got a couple of questions here, and I wonder if I can just jump in and ask them now. The first is to say that this delegate is not really understanding how the value-added assessments work and how they would complete the value-added assessments. I wonder if you could pick that question up.
If I understand what the question's driving at, the value-added assessment is done for you at CEM. That CEM will have on record your baseline test performance. When you get your GCSE A-level results, they get uploaded to CEM. And then on the same day as the results come out, you can download the spreadsheets containing all of these graphs, all of this data showing your value-added performance as calculated by CEM. You then need to put some time aside as an academic deputy or as a management team to drill into them and see what the data is telling you. But all the statistical calculation, all of that sort of thing, is part of the natural cycle of what CEM does for you. Do you think that's answering the question, the drive of what they were getting at?
I think so. I think that helps. But I'll leave it to the delegate to come back if there are any further questions around that. There is another one here, which is CEM IBE is not predicting our German or DT higher level outcomes. This school doesn't have GCSE results as they're an MYP school. So how would you predict for achievement where there are gaps?
This is quite difficult, really, because CEM doesn't always calculate for all subjects because of the low statistics that are inherent. I've worked in schools where we used to do media studies, and because that wasn't a subject that was done across a broad sweep of schools, there was no CEM statistics for it. The best we could do there, it's not desperately helpful possibly, the best we could do there was to look at subjects that we thought were broadly comparable and then sort of take our lead from those. But perhaps it would help for me to re-emphasize yes, CEM does predictions or projections of grades and calculates the value added based on that. Internally within the school, you may well be setting challenge grades, aspirational grades for your pupils. And then you can, and those grades I would suggest are based on teachers' best professional judgment, and the CEM data, the CEM baseline data, is one instrument to help that. But if you've got your own internal challenge grades, then in subjects where you don't have CEM statistics, it's possible to do your own comparisons of outcomes to where you thought they ought to be in terms of the challenge grade. You might want to make it not quite the challenge grade because that's aspirational, but from a combination of looking at different subjects which you have CEM data and your own internal statistics, because although it's not easy to standardize, you can do raw residuals, as it were, just comparing, just subtracting their actual outcome from the projected grade or your own internal grade. And you can do some measure of data analysis in that regard. Or indeed, slightly cheeky of me to suggest it, get some outside consultant to have a look at it for you. Other consultants are available, of course. Departmental, sorry, does that answer that question, do you think?
Yes, I think so, Jonathan. Thank you.
Can provide charts like this one for individual departments at in a particular year. So here we've got in red the actual national regression line and the scatter of pupils in that department in that year compared to that. I think the different color coding here refers to boys and girls. So you can see the individual cohort with overlaid on the national regression line. And it's of some use to look for clusters in this. How are boys doing in comparison to girls? Maybe some clustering in regard to different sets. And you may want to look at individuals. Number 16 here on this chart sticks out. You might want to look at that individual in other subjects to see if this was some underperformance that is matched across a broad sweep of subjects, or whether that is just a glitch in that particular subject. As senior managers, as a senior leader myself, I've sometimes been asked to look into individual teacher performance in terms of value added, but I have done my level best to resist that as strongly as possible. Partly because I think this doesn't help the use of data, because it is making manifest this implied judgment. And if that is going on, then there becomes a reluctance to address the baseline data, which is so important if you have this output at the end of it, which is turning into an implied threat. But even then, when you start looking at individual teachers, the statistics become extremely thin, and there are many factors that can influence a value-added performance at the teacher level. You know, is this particular teacher always given lower ability sets? Slightly more facetious, perhaps. Are they always timetabled last thing on a Friday afternoon? I don't believe that we should be addressing individual teacher performance at the value-added level. I would argue that based on statistics, broad range of factors, but I would passionately argue it based on getting value added out of teachers' faces so they can get on with using the baseline data to generate discussions, support their pupils, stretch them, aspire them, and do their jobs in the classroom. I want to sort of draw towards a conclusion by suggesting something that isn't often done, and I think it's not part of the standard MIGIS or CEM analysis. And that is to actually look at your value added by band. If you remember that the MIGIS results are divided broadly into A, B, C, D type bands, and by massaging the data in a spreadsheet, you can start to produce your own charts of value added performance by individual bands. Here's a particular school I was involved with. You can see there was a value added issue at that school. Broadly, you look at it and think, we've got work to do here. But actually, if you look at band B in particular, and look at the comparison between boys and girls, then perhaps band B is one of the most significant drivers of our results. Yes, the value-added performance for the girls is broadly better than the value-added performance for the boys. And I know band D in the boys sticks out, and we've got work to do there. But the contrast between boys and girls at band B, your forgotten middle, as I rather facetiously sometimes refer to them, that is information that you wouldn't necessarily see in the broad data. Indeed, it's possible in your own particular school that the MIGIS bands as defined at CEM, A, B, C, D, are a little bit too broad for you. You know, you may want to generate your own bands. This is something that you have to set up in your own spreadsheets, and I could give tips on how to do that if you're interested on another occasion. but you're not constrained to just using the CEM bands. You can divide your ability range up into whatever bands you see fit, but it might expose some detailed information that you wouldn't otherwise see in the broad spread of analysis. And in particular, it could be your hidden results driver and where you need to have some focus on policy. Indeed, it might be interesting if we went back to these charts at the individual departmental level to superimpose the bands on those and to see what data that reveals for us. I'm not suggesting in this particular instance that there's anything much of any interest to see here, but it is worthwhile, although you might have to manually draw it in, it is worthwhile putting those bands on to see what might be revealed from that, or indeed whatever bands you choose to generate for yourself within your own school. It could reveal something here which is useful for whole school policy. But again, I would just caveat that by saying you need to be looking at bands over time. I believe that previous chart that I showed you, where I pointed out the wide difference between band B and boys and girls, that was accumulated data over several years, individual years. The single data point instance is not something you really ought to be basing too many conclusions on. So that is a suggestion of something that isn't part of the standard analysis suite, but I've seen deployed in several schools, which has actually thrown up interesting data that you might not see in the details. If you remember when I showed you that broadly flat chart of the average standardized residual, I referred there to your school's position there might be hiding interesting detail. And that was the sort of thing I was referring to. And indeed, when I said at the beginning, there might be at least one suggestion for something here that's new, I'm rather hoping that might be new and useful to some of you. But to draw all this rambling to some level of if I can speak, draw all this to some level of conclusion. I would say no data is bad data, but it can be badly used. I believe that we need to emphasize and focus on the use of the baseline data. Use that to evaluate trends. It's of great importance to individual teachers dealing with individual pupils in the classroom. But I also think it's of use to us as senior leaders, evaluating trends in the aptitudes of our cohorts, particularly over time. We need to be sure to hold our nerve over fluctuations, these natural variations that you get year on year. You need to be thinking in terms of what other indicators you have, public exam results being one, but there are other indicators that we have within our schools. How well does the data that we get match what we already know about the school? In some level, we need to fold it into our annual cycle so that we are putting some time aside when we're dealing with our development plans to consider trends that we're seeing in the data. In the end, as I said, perhaps nothing should be too much of a surprise for us, but the details can be illuminating and can, in instances, switch on that sort of necessary thing that makes a big difference to the outcomes in our school. I used to have what some might call a slightly jaundiced view. I didn't think it was myself, but I was of the view that oftentimes it was useful to subscribe to some educational initiative or teaching philosophy, to put it that way, not because I desperately believed that that was the way forward, but because I think occasionally anything that shakes up your thinking about teaching and learning in the school has to be a good thing. But if it's based on, pardon me, some level of data, some level of information, then it can only add to that. I think I'll, as many people might say, long overdue, I'll draw a halt at that point and see if there are any further questions or indeed people who want to violently disagree with things that I've said. I'd be glad if they violently agree, but I'm realist.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great presentation. I do have one more question that's just been posted, which asks, how would you identify any bias data that's been collected by chance? Can you identify any bias data?
That in general, in terms of data, is always your biggest challenge. In science, it's your biggest challenge. In any application of data, it's your biggest challenge. If I may tell a story, slightly, well, forgive me, it's a story that comes from recent times. I was summoned quite recently, a couple of year or so ago, to my academic deputy's office because the chem data we'd got from the Midgis tests didn't compare to what he was seeing in the entrance exams. I mean, this is an independent school with an entrance exam, and he was slightly worried that his cohort had dropped in ability. Well, that turned out to be that chem had re-standardized the data, and indeed, broad schools across the country were seeing what appeared to be a drop in their intake due to a statistically important and necessary re-standardization on chem's part. So that story gives you one way in which you can detect this. If it's something that takes you by surprise, if something doesn't gel with what you know about your school and it takes you by surprise, that is a way of looking at some level of bias. I rather cheekily showed a slide earlier where I said that some schools talk in terms of giving the Midgis test just after the school cross country, so all the kids are shattered. They don't perform that well on the test, so the value added looks good. But again, it's not about the value added, it's about the accurate baseline data. So, but there is perhaps a bias that sometimes creeps in if you haven't briefed the pupils well, if you haven't allayed their fears, if you're doing it at some time of the day where they are tired, etc. You need to look into perhaps that sort of thing. But it's data that takes you by surprise. But in the end, the only reliable way of weeding out biased or fluctuating data is to look at the trends over time. Hopefully random variation averages itself out. It's difficult to detect biased, corrupt, whatever the phrase you use, data in a single instance, unless it is something marked that takes you by surprise compared to what other instruments you have. Then you have to work on the 3 to 5 year average and perhaps hold your nerve while you wait to see if a trend develops.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's covered all the questions that we've had. We've had a few people that have noted that they've had issues with the screen freezing or losing audio at points. So just to say to everybody that's joined us today, we will be putting the full recording of this webinar up on the CEM website next week. So you will be able to access it if there are any bits that you've missed during the course of the webinar today. But Jonathan, are there any final points from you?
If I must just quickly jump in on that, I apologise if that has happened to people. Internet is not always necessarily reliable, and I think I'm right in saying that, well, I know I'm right in saying that we're doing this presentation 3 times, so one of the recordings will be continuous without breaks in it. So we'll patch something together, which is fine for people to view in the future.
Yes, and I think it usually takes us about a week to get it up onto the CEM website on the events page, so you'd be able to access it in a few days' time. And just a reminder that you will have your certificate of attendance by email in about an hour's time. And I think that's all the housekeeping bits, Jonathan. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to the final points?
No, just a thank you for people for attending and putting up with my ramblings. And a general wish, certainly, to my UK colleagues about what they're going through in terms of producing grades for pupils, but to the broader colleagues across the world, stay well, stay safe, and good luck to you as hopefully this pandemic winds itself to a close.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As Jonathan said, we are repeating this webinar if anybody did miss bits and wants to join another live session. Otherwise, we'll get the recording to you. But many thanks, everybody.